third in a series of talks we've been having about the history of Manhattan, which correlates with our project we're doing this year to put markers along the linear trail and other trailheads here in town about the history, the historical points of interest. So you'll see more about that coming, but in February we learned about the early Indian villages here and the early Indian inhabitants. And in March we learned about some of the early settlers that came and helped actually name the town and start the town. And today we're going to hear about what it was like getting here for most of those people who found their way to Manhattan and helped make it the town it is today. Susan Church is our speaker. We're lucky that she moved here a couple of years ago because her daughter's been living here for 28 years. So as with many of us, we go where the grandkids are in retirement. And we're lucky to have her because she also has become a volunteer at the Genealogical Library, and we're benefiting from her knowledge and expertise there as well. She's a native of West Virginia, so if I use that in my introduction this time, it's legit. So 2 months ago it wasn't, but she has been a director of museums, the resume here in front of me. She's been in Iowa and at the National Frontier Trails Museum in Independence. She's been at the North House Museum in Greenbrier, director of Jackson County Historical Society in Missouri. Just a lot of credentials behind her name. She's a Civil War historian primarily. But today she's going to be talking to us about the role of women and children and the 5,000-mile or the 5,000 cattle that came with them on some of these journeys. So I will let her tell her story. She knows it much better than I do. And then I will see you at the end. Suzanne?
If everyone would look over this way, this is 10 foot long and 4 foot wide. This is your wagon. This is the size you're going to take for the next 6 to 8 months for your family. Not yourself, for your family. So if you have a family of 4, 6, or 8, this is going to be pretty tight. We can't go any larger than 4 foot with our wheels 5 foot wide because then we can't make it through the mountain passes. So that's why it's important. Dr. Elijah White wrote in 1844. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Wrote in 1844 that he was on the wagon train, and this was not his first wagon train because he went back and forth several times. But he talked about the 1,000 men and women and 5,000, if you can imagine this, horses, sheep, cows, of course. They took milk cows. They had to take oxen. Many of them had an extra set of oxen, 4 to 6 oxen that they would pull in their wagon. Chickens weren't counted. I can't imagine taking a chicken on a 2,000-mile journey in a little cage or whatever stuck to the side of a wagon. But I can't imagine. Yesterday there was a few of us here that did a program in Topeka, and we were on our way back, just looking at the prairie coming back off of 70 and imagining 1,000 people walking across and 5,000 head of cattle and sheep. I can't even, what a sight that would have been. Can you just imagine what that sight would have been? It's absolutely amazing. And so how are we going to go? Cross 2,000 miles. Well, we're going to take the 19th century version of an RV. It has everything. It's got a bedroom, a living room, a kitchen. It's got a basement and a garage for all your husband's tools. The only thing that's missing is the 4-legged engine. So this is our 19th century RV. So how big is our RV? We were just talking about that. It is 4 foot wide, 9 to 10 foot long, and the longer that you got, it didn't go much beyond 10 feet because it becomes unruly. The back wheels are 50 inches, front wheels are 44. Anybody know why the front wheels are smaller than the back wheels? For making turns.
Think about making a turn with a wagon. You have to have your wheels smaller in order to start that turn. The wheelbase, again, was slightly just a little over 5 feet wide. Your wagon weighed about 1,300 pounds. And most people took their farm wagons. They worked fine on the farm. They hauled hay and grain and everything around. And so they thought they were just fine with that. And that actually worked out pretty well. With your oxen, who weighed 1,600 to 2,000 pounds, plus just that, you had about 3,300 pounds of weight. And where are they going to go? This is where they're going to go. 2,000 miles across Kansas, Nebraska. Of course, those weren't states yet, quite all of them. But this is where they're going to go. They couldn't even have thought or imagined what this trip was going to be like. If you can just imagine, I can't imagine getting in my car and driving 2,000 miles, let alone walking 2,000 miles. In order to get ready to go our 2,000 miles, it's going to take you about a year to get ready. You're going to have to sell everything you own, unless you're taking it on the trail with you. You're going to need $1,000 in cash. Supplies for the trip are going to be about $560, which in today's market is $21,500. You're going to need 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon for each person. You're going to need beans, lard, coffee, rice, salt, biscuits, dried fruit, and sugar. You're also going to need chests and boxes that store everything. You're going to need a wash tub and an iron stove. You're going to need a cloth mattress. You're going to need blankets. You're going to need pillows. And you're going to need a tent, because guess what? We're not sleeping in that 10-foot by 4-foot because we can't. There's not enough room. You're going to need pots and pans, which we hang on the outside of our wagon. We're going to be 9 pairs of shoes. Now, this was the book that they used back in the early years called the Prairie Traveler, and it told you everything that you needed for the trip. So I doubt that most people ever had 9 pairs of shoes in their life, let alone 9 pairs of shoes times all of your children, and we know how fast kids grow out of shoes. So you're going to need an axe and augers, spokes. That's why I said we had to have the garage for our husband's tools. You're going to need a wagon tongue. Yeah, your wagon tongue's probably going to break when you get into the mountains. You're going to need heavy ropes to get you down the mountain. You're going to need chains at night to chain all of the wagons together. And as a matter of fact, in northern Kansas, they actually had a tornado one night. And every wagon that was chained together, the whole wagon, there were 30 of them, actually flipped over. But everyone was okay, which was a miracle because they had tents. The tents were in the inside. Tents blew away, but then when the wagons flipped, it kind of helped them. So I always thought that was kind of strange, chaining your wagons together, until I read a diary. You're going to need a hoe and a plow. You're going to need a shovel. You're going to need tar and a bucket because we've got to keep those wheels greased and going. They're going to need ox shoes because horses, oxen, they're going to wear the hooves down in 2,000 miles. You're going to need a spade and extra wheels. Now imagine putting extra wheels that's 50 inches tall and how much that must weigh, or a 44-inch over here in our wagon. This is basically a painting of what it would look like. This is Westport, which is by Independence, of course, which is where the old landing went. And it was not impossible for them to have been there for 3 or 4 months before they could leave. And does anybody know what I said? They went forth when the grass was ready. Anybody know how high the grass has to be before you can go forward west? As high as the horse's hooves or the oxen hooves. That way they knew that the grass out west was also beginning to grow. And as they progressed, that was very important. They had to have grass and they had to have good water. So this is a painting of what they thought it would look like. So again, what do? Are we going to take another wagon? What if we have a family of 6 or 8? Are we going to be able to take another wagon? Are we going to be able to afford to take another wagon? There were some families who took more than one wagon, and most of the time they ended up losing a wagon along the way, which was not uncommon to lose your wagon by the time you got out near Fort Bridger or farther along. So everyone walked. I loved to watch Wagon Train when I was growing up. They all got on the wagon and you'd see them going along and they'd have the reins in their hands. Of course, they had horses and we didn't use horses because horses would never have lasted 6 to 8 months on the trail. They could not have pulled that weight. There was not a lot of good water. The grass was not that good. Cows were the best, oxen, and if you had to eat meat, it was a lot easier to kill your oxen or cow than it certainly was to kill your horse and eat it. So everyone but pregnant women, very pregnant women, the elderly, small children, and the sick walked. Why did they go? I love this quote. This is Josiah Royce in 1859. And he wrote, "The romance of it all. One sought a romantic and far-off golden land of promise, and one sought the wildness of the world, amid the desolation of the lonely plains, amid the half-known but always horrible dangers of the very one-met experiences." Can't you tell he hadn't been on the trail yet? They were going to have some experiences. This is Catherine Sager. She writes in 1843, "My father was one of the restless ones who are not content to remain in one place for a long time." Oregon, oh, Oregon. Emigration was the theme all winter. In April 1844, we started across the plains. And of course, the kids loved it because it was camping out. That was a lot of fun. They thought that was pretty much a fun thing. The practical reasons, birth rates had skyrocketed to 23 million. Immigration had increased greatly. The cities were growing, becoming places where families did not want to stay. Good farming land was becoming scarce. And you could get 620 acres for a husband and a wife in Oregon. But then, you could put a stick in the ground in Oregon, and the next day it would bear fruit. And tomatoes as big as melons, and watermelons the size of small boulders. And every day was perfect weather. Oregon. Oh, Oregon. That's what we heard. Or you could have a calling from God to minister to the savage, uncivilized Western native tribes. And that's basically what a lot of the Eastern people, the American Board of Commissions for Foreign Missions, thought. So they were sending foreign missions out to places like China and Africa, and they finally realized that maybe they ought to be sending them out to the West. So what did they say? There was over 1,000 diaries written, and I have no idea how many letters were written home. 90% of the population in the mid-1840s could read and write. I always thought that was an amazing number. So let's hear their words to see what they actually have to say. So 15-year-old Miriam, I was possessed with a spirit of adventure and a desire to see what was new and strange. 15, just married. And then there was Margaret Wilson. She says, "I am going with him, as there is no other alternative." That's what she told her mother. Her husband was Dr. Wilson,
And he was going out, he felt a calling to go to the gold mines, gold fields at that time, and to help the sick and injured. And you'll notice she must have been a pretty strong lady because she is the grandmother of General George S. Patton. And then there's poor George, dear uncle. First of all, Frances died on June 4th, and then Maria, she followed on the 6th. Next came Polly, who died on the 8th, and Amos, well, he died on the 9th, and Lafayette, he soon followed. He died on the 10th. Now, Elizabeth was the wife of Amos. She didn't die till the 11th. Her baby died on the 17th. You see, we lost 7 persons in a few short days, all died of cholera. What I found interesting was those 5,000 horses and sheep and cows, they crossed them at West Point first. 5,000. And then the next morning, there would at least be a few hundred of them that had crossed back over the river because they liked where they were before. They'd been there for a few months. So we all know what horses, cows, and sheep do in the water, right? So the next day, when they finally get all 5,000 across, what happens is now we're crossing wagons. And where are pots and pans? They're on the outside. And where is all our other goods inside? They're on the inside, and the wagon is wet. So people actually started dying of cholera a day or two after they left Westport. When they got to Nebraska, it was unbelievable the people who died in Nebraska. And I always wondered, maybe those of you who are livestock people out there will tell me what the thought was of crossing all of the animals first. Anybody have any idea? I had no idea either. You would think you would take the wagons across and then come back and get the livestock, or that maybe the livestock would follow the wagon. But in every case, the livestock went over first. This is how many streams, places, rivers that they crossed just here in Kansas. So you can see how many times they actually were crossing water. And again, you're talking about 5,000, 1,000, however many animals that you're crossing. And of course, those that are walking are wading the rivers across. So you're not going to go change your clothes or whatever. Kids, you're going to get water in your mouth. You know, kids are going to want to play in the water. And then there was Narcissa Whitman. She was one of the first known white women to cross the Continental Divide and the Rocky Mountains. And she writes, "Our manner of living is preferable to any in the States. I never was so contented and happy, neither I have enjoyed such health for years." And they went along in the early years, 1836 Narcissa did, and her husband Marcus. And of course you may have heard of the Whitman Mission. It's quite famous. The Whitman Massacre is another great story. Narcissa and her husband Marcus wanted to set up a fort, a farm for the Cayuse tribe, which was on the Walla Walla on the Columbia Plateau. This is the farm. You can see they did very well. In the beginning, they got along very well with the Cayuse. The Cayuse enjoyed learning about the vegetables that they didn't grow. And they taught them, religion in English. They refused to use the Cayuse language. And so about the 1840s, when all of our wagon trains are beginning to go through, they would stop at the Whitman Mission and they would sell them vegetables because, of course, by that time they were pretty much out of everything. Wagon trains that were late leaving, they actually provided them winter quarters. They provided them with food and shelter, and the Cayuse began to get suspicious. which ultimately will lead to the Whitman massacre. She writes home in December of 1836, "My dear mother, that I shall never see their dear faces again while I live." She wrote home every letter that Narcissa wrote was asking her mother and father and her sister and brother, who had families of their own, she was always begging them to come. And I always think, considering what happened, it was a good thing that they didn't go. The other white woman was Eliza Hart Spalding, and she and her husband Henry, they traveled with the Whitmans, and they were going to minister to the Nez Perce Indians. And they had a different view. They wanted to learn the language, and they wanted the Nez Perce to learn religion, Christianity, in their language. They had a daughter who they also named Eliza, who was the first white American child born west of the Rockies, and she was fluent in Nez Perce and also, of course, in English. And when she got old enough, they sent her to the Whitman mission because they thought that they had better teachers there to board and to learn. And she was there in 1847. She wrote a diary. And she lived to be about 93, I believe, and there is a wonderful newspaper article that they interviewed her on the Whitman massacre, and she was there during that massacre. Now we pick up our Sager family again. Remember the father, he had that restless spirit, and she talks about having one wagon and a yoke of old oxen, and her father wasn't very good at taking care of those oxen or getting them to do what he wanted them to do. About 90% of the wagons that headed west, the men had never yoked oxen before, and they had never driven oxen. And we don't get up on the wagon and drive them with reins. We walk beside them with a small whip. We don't use the whip, we just crack the whip. And during one of the days on the trail, the wagon oxes ran away and ran up on a small little bluff like we have here and overturned. And the mother happened to be inside of the wagon. And she was pretty well knocked senseless, their mother. So Catherine had climbed in the wagon to check on her mother. And as she's getting out of the wagon, her dress catches on the axle, and the wagon runs over her leg. And she is 9 at the time. And then after that, the sickness became common. Again, you can see how we're crossing. My father and brothers became sick. Some of them often had to rise from their sick beds to wade streams and get the oxen safely across. People were very good about helping each other. If they had an extra teenage son, if they had someone else along, maybe they had hired somebody to go with them, they were very good about helping get people across when people got sick. They worked together as a very good unit, most of these wagon trains. And her father became quite ill, and he decided that his last days had come. He begged Captain Shaw. Does anybody recognize the name of Captain Shaw? He was the head of the Donner Party. Yeah, he was the captain of that. And again, as the farther west you go, there are many cutoffs, there are many shortcuts. And as we all can imagine in here, if we start that game where you tell one person here, and then they tell the next person, and they tell the next person, that when you get to the end of the room, that's not exactly how we got started here. Well, that's what happened with a lot of these cutoffs. And so people got impatient, and they were tired of being on the road. Because what did you do every day? You walked. And the next day, you walked. And the next day, you walk. And you get up and you might stop maybe once every 10 days to wash in a creek or to repair a wagon, and then the next day you walk and you walk. And so a lot of them got impatient, which was also what happened to the Donners, that they took the wrong turn. Her father was buried the next day. He asked Captain Shaw if he would see to the children. Mother, of course, is still sick. So mother passes away. So the grave was near the road, covered with dirt. The train moved on. So in 26 days, Catherine Sager lost both her mother and her father. And then there's the California Trail. Gold, gold, gold. Have you heard? You can pick up gold just by walking along a stream. And people, prospectors, are coming in with their aprons full of gold. Huh? The Californian wrote that. Now here's our California Trail. And you can see they get all the way down to Fort Bridger, and then your Oregon Trail will split and go north, whereas your Southern Trail into Oregon will split and go south, usually about Fort Bridger. Now, where they would get in trouble is the Great Salt Lake. That is 40 miles wide. There is no grass, there is no water, there is nothing but sand, which bogs your wagons down, even if you still have a wagon at that point, bogs your wagons down, and your oxen makes it really difficult for them to pull those wagons. A lot of people died there. So, remember our romantic? This is his wife. If we're going, let us go. And meet what we were to meet bravely. I seated myself in the wagon, my little 2-year-old child Mary. She was placed beside me. 1849, Sarah Royce. She was married to that romantic. Unfortunately, Josiah, Sarah, and Mary were going to California. And when they got to the Great Salt Lake, they lost their wagon. Their oxen died. And they pretty much lost everything. Sarah unfortunately was a disciple of God, and she believed that you needed to stop and take the Sabbath off. So on these wagon trains, depending upon the weather, and depending upon where your next grass and clear water was, they had to move. And so they left Sarah and Josiah because they had no choice. But usually Josiah and Sarah could catch up with them. So if they went a little bit faster on Monday, they could probably catch up with the train. But unfortunately, they made a wrong turn and never could find the train again. And they lost everything. And then we have wonderful diarists who did drawings. I thought this one was an interesting one of the drawing by Louisa Frizzell in 1852 of the Native Americans. I thought that was really kind of an interesting one. She talks about rumors. As I said before, if we play that game where we start here and we end in the back, it's going to be entirely different. There were people headed back east who got so far, their child died, the wife said, I'm not going any farther, we're going back east. There were many who just turned around and headed back. And so, of course, they would meet people on the trail, and they would tell them, don't go any farther. There's measles, there's dysentery, there's cholera, there's all kinds of things going on. And you didn't know what to believe. I thought this one was great. She saw a fine sheet iron stove, and that was quite common. That was one of the first things that they got rid of, was that darn iron stove. And they got rid of that because it was so heavy. but it was great for baking bread. So they would put it alongside the trail, and as the trails would go by, the women would stop and bake bread. Then they would just keep on going. And they thought that was pretty good, so she stopped and she cooked on it that night, and she probably had a really good meal. And then they just left it there for the next train. And death. Death was there most all the time. Anywhere between 25 to 35,000 people died along the Overland Trail. They estimate anywhere between 300 and 350,000 took the trail. And so if you can imagine, if you were along in 1842 or 43, the creeks and the rivers might have been pretty good. But what if you were in 1852, 1853, 1854? Those creeks just don't get a chance because you have the winter storms who move it out, but then you have wagon trains constantly going through, constantly letting their animals go through first. So death on the trail was something that they got very much used to. Roles were reversed on the trail, which I thought was kind of cool. Women, of course, got sick, kids got sick, something injured, men got injured, stepped on by an oxen, something would happen. Maybe they couldn't get out there and ride. And so the women began herding livestock. Yoked oxen, something they would never have thought of back home, especially those New Englanders who came down from the cities or the immigrants from the city. And they even took a turn at guard duty, because if you have that many cattle, they're going to get stolen by the Indians. And so that was one of the things the natives in the early years, they had no problems with the natives. The natives thought that they were kind of an interesting thing that was going through their land. It wasn't until the 1860s, 70s that it got really bad. And finally the natives said, whoa, wait, they're killing our buffalo. What's happening here? They're invading us. It wasn't until then they began to have trouble with the Native Americans. But in the early years, they didn't. As a matter of fact, about those 9 pairs of shoes we were talking about earlier, the women noticed that the Native American, that the women wore moccasins, and they seemed to get along in the prairie no matter what kind of grass or whatever they were walking on. And they bought moccasins from the Native American women for 25 cents. And the Native American women would draw out the kids' foot, and they would be able to sit right there, and in no time at all, while they were overnighting, they could make shoes, make moccasins, and that worked out really well. So in the early years, it was a nice give and take up until about the early 1860s. And then more and more buffalo were getting killed and left leg. That was one of the things that was very much against what they believed. If you're going to kill the buffalo, that buffalo needs to be meat. Sometimes the men got a little carried away and just was the excitement of killing, and they would kill 8 or 10 buffalo and they would leave them lay. And that's thousands of pounds of meat. And the Native Americans were not happy about that at all. So fantastic stories of adventure were heard, of course. Remember Oregon, you can stick in the ground, it's going to bear fruit tomorrow. And they began pouring in to Kansas. So why did they come to Kansas? Well, the same thing. Adventure, new life, religion, but mainly for the promise of land. To say I wept bitterly would be but faintly expressed, the ocean of tears I shed on leaving my beloved home. So we're going to leave this beloved home, and here's what we're going to. I can't disagree with her crying. So this is a shanty, or a sod house, pretty well typical sod house that they had at the time. It was usually a one room. Sometimes you had to sort of crawl down underneath of it. They would build the sod up. Sometimes they would put a India rubber tarp on the top and then lay sod on the top of that, which was really nice, except it was good for snakes. Now, I have a thing about snakes. Saying I grew up in West Virginia, we had a lot of snakes, and I don't like snakes. That's what hoes are good for, snakes. And one day, this woman was in her soddy house, and she was cooking away. She thought she saw something hanging down from a Muslim piece she had hung on the wall, and it was moving, and it was dark. So she looked a little bit closer, and darn, it was a snake. And so she went out to her husband, and he was out plowing in the field, and she said, "You need to go in there and get that snake." And I'm not going back in there. Do you get that snake? So he goes out, goes in the soddy house, and no problem, dear. It's just this little snake. And she didn't go back in the house, especially after he had 50 snakes piled up in the front yard. She said, "That's it, not going back in there." So I can only imagine. And then also, there's a great, I don't know, I want to call it a great snake story, but a woman sat her baby in the middle of the floor with some toys to play, and she went out to the garden just to get some fresh vegetables for dinner that evening. And she heard the baby screaming. She ran back into the soddy, and a huge rattlesnake had wrapped itself around the baby's arm and was continuing to strike the baby. She finally got the snake killed and off. I'm not really sure how, but the baby's arm had grown 3 times its size and had turned purple. And she ran to the nearest farmhouse. She ran 2 miles to the nearest farmhouse because she knew they had brandy. And she fed that baby as much brandy as she could get down that baby. And that baby survived. And there are several stories about liquor and rattlesnake bites. I don't know if that's an old wives' tale or what that is, but I'm glad the baby survived. Here's another soddy, another Kansas soddy, and she talks about how she went to visit the neighbors, and she couldn't hardly get inside because it was so small. And there was 5 in the family, and then they had visitors from Wilson. They were visiting, and there were 9 people then in this small room. So look at this. So this is a typical inside a soddy. The stove pretty much takes up all of the room. So I would imagine when you're cooking in the summertime, that'd be pretty warm in there. Although in the wintertime, that might be nice. And I haven't quite figured out where they sleep. There is a piece over here that looks like a partition of some kind, and maybe there was some beds beyond that. But I thought, well, there's all the necessities, your pots and your pans and your teapot and your bucket, and, there's everything you need. And I think one of the wonderful things to realize about our immigrants, no matter whether they went all the way to California or Oregon or Kansas, is the fact that they were brave. They had a sense of adventure. They wanted to know what was beyond the next rock, what was beyond the next hill. What did the ocean look like? So many of them talked about in their letters home, talked about what it was like to see the ocean, or what it was like to see the mountains, Independence Rock, Chimney Rock. You had to get to Independence Rock by the 4th of July, and they would celebrate independence there. And what it was like just to see these things and to write home about them. I think for those of us, I guess it would be like going to the moon. If you look at it, it'd be like going to the moon or going to another continent, that type of thing. But they had a great sense of adventure. And they were romantics. They were very romantic about all of this. I saw someone, I was watching the Old West, and the other day, and I saw somebody say, well, how did they make babies, and how did they do this, and how did they do that? And it's like, this was life. This was life for them. This is what they did every day. You're talking 6 to 8 months. Can you imagine the friendships that they made along the way? And there's several ones where People from New England didn't exactly care for people from the deep south because they talked funny and they cooked it different and that type of thing. And yet, within a few months, they were taking care of each other's babies. And if you got sick, they were there. Roles changed. Men cooked, women rode guard. That's just the way it was. And so I think that and our Kansas immigrants, our Kansas relatives, we changed this country. We did this by being romantic and by being practical and being adventuresome. Here's our Josiah Royce again. The attraction of the prairie, which simply gets into your blood and makes you dissatisfied, away from it, the low-lying hills and the unobstructed view of the horizon, and the fleecy clouds driven by the never-failing winds. Just beyond this dark and death-like wall, the land of heavenly promise was known to lie. Some were born, some died, some got rich, some lost everything. Some built cities, some built states, but all of them were forever changed by the opening